we are here, right? Like this is our community, and there are things that we can do here that maybe we're not able to do when it comes to international cases. And of course, it's important to take action internationally, but I think it's when there are things that are happening in our own community, it's really important to speak up. And I think events like this are good opportunities to remind ourselves that the reason that we have so many rights that we have right now is because people decided to speak up, because people fought for these rights. And maybe if we stay silent when it comes to discrimination, when it comes to injustices that happen here in our community, things can always get worse. And this is the Iranian experience, because like in my home country, we ended up losing a lot of the rights that we already had after the 1979 revolution, especially as women. We had many rights that we lost after the revolution. And I think that's a good reminder that when we don't speak up, things can go wrong. And maybe like it's good to just remind ourselves not to take the rights that we have for granted. So I should probably start with my experience. I'm from, as John mentioned, I'm from a Baha'i community in Iran. Baha'i faith is a religion that is actually originated in Iran, but Baha'i faith followers are still being persecuted in the country, and so like Baha'is are basically second-class citizens. Baha'is don't have the right to higher education, and that's why what's happening to Baha'is right now, we call it a cultural genocide, because they don't have, when people don't have the right to educate themselves, this is going to affect their next generation as well. Baha'is are not allowed to work in any places that they want. So for example, if you want to work in government or in education or healthcare, you're not allowed. A lot of Baha'i businesses, even right now, even these days, they get closed down only because of the people's beliefs. We have people in prison because of their belief system. And again, because of that, not having access to that higher education was like something that really motivated me as a young person to get involved with human rights activism and speaking up for Baha'is' rights in my community, in my country. Also, something else that was very important to me was that women didn't have the same rights. So as a woman, you didn't have at that time, and still don't have the right to get divorced. You don't have the right to custody of your own children. So a girl who is older than 9-year-old can be married off. Girls older than 9-year-olds were considered responsible in criminal courts, or they were considered adults in criminal courts. So there were so many issues that women also experience. And that was another thing that motivated me to get involved with the 1 million signature campaign. You might have heard about that. So it's a campaign where women were, they went into streets, talked to people, and we informed them about the discriminatory laws that existed in the country, and asked them if they wanted to sign this petition. So a part of, one goal of that campaign was to collect 1 million signatures from people, from citizens of the country, bring it to the parliament and ask them for change. Another goal was to raise awareness. So, and that's what we did. We organized workshops, a lot of informational sessions, educational events, and all of that. And also I co-founded an organization, an NGO for women's rights in my hometown. And so all of that kind of, all of these things were the reasons that I ended up getting arrested by the Revolutionary Guards in Iran. And when I got arrested, they moved me from my hometown, which is a city north of Tehran, to Tehran. That was like 4 hours and a half drive. And they put me in solitary confinement. So from there, I was in solitary confinement for 27 days, as you mentioned, 45 days in general in prison. And I just want to give you some information about like how it actually looked like. So it's the prison cell. I was actually in two different prison cells. One of them was a smaller and it didn't have a toilet in it. So it was just a room that was carpeted, and it had a small window on like all the way on the top, and it was covered so you couldn't see the sky. And I was given a few blankets. So I used some blankets to put under me, so, because I had to sleep on the floor. There was no bed. And then one blanket as a pillow and a few blankets to put on top of me. And that's all I had. And I just want to give you some more information about like my, maybe my mental state, because when I got arrested, I felt like I knew a lot. I felt like I know what's going to happen. I knew what to expect, because I was coming from this community that was already persecuted. I knew relatives who were in prison before. I knew friends who were in solitary confinement before. And because I was a human rights activist, I talked to prisoners who actually been through this process. So I was familiar with it. It wasn't something I wasn't familiar with. But something I noticed was that it's very different when you hear about something and when you actually experience it. So, and something also happened was that I was going there thinking that, I'm ready to fight. This is my right. I'm speaking up, and what's the worst thing that can happen? I'm willing to give my life for this. And then in solitary confinement, I found out that there are worse things that can happen than losing your life. And that was the actual, like the solitary confinement for me. And I want to like talk about that experience more, because I think and the reason is that I want to connect that to the Canadian experience of solitary confinement. And the reason I'm talking about the details of it, I don't want to traumatize you, but I want us to have an idea of what's happening, how does it look like when people are in solitary confinement. So yeah, just the first day I arrived there, I got into this cell, and I was like, the guard asked me if I wanted the lights on or off for the nighttime when I wanted to sleep. And I was like, okay, just turn them off because I want to sleep. And you don't have access to the switch when you are in solitary. So the switch was outside. And so I asked them, they turned the light off. And in the middle of the night, I woke up and it was pitch black, and I couldn't turn the light on. And that was the only night that I asked for that. And after that, I had to ask them to just leave the lights on. So I ended up staying there 45 days and not being able to turn the lights off, basically, because that was my only option, was to leave it off for the whole night, because I couldn't really call for the guards to come back and turn it on. And something else that that was like really difficult to deal with was like not having anything to do. And I know that right now, because of the pandemic, a lot of people are in a way isolated. Like, people are alone. Some people miss like hugging someone or like having physical touch with someone else. And this is something that happens in solitary confinement, with the difference that you don't have your phone there, you don't have Netflix and or books or anything that entertains you. And I remember actually, especially the first few days, I would wake up and then I go like this looking for my phone, or even feel like I could feel the vibration of my phone, but then looking for it and then realizing that, oh, I don't have my phone with me, I'm in prison. So that was also like a difficult part of it, because even a pen or a pencil or like a piece of paper, these were all privileges that you could get if you answered all the questions that they wanted. So I didn't have any access to a pen the first few days. However, I found a pen under the carpet, which was nice. So I was able to use that one pen like in secret, because I knew they were watching through the cameras. And I didn't have any piece of paper. So what I used was the silicone, like the package that they were using to bring my food. So after I finished my food, I just like write on that. I wrote down some math problems and then try to solve the math problems myself, just to keep your mind busy, because you don't really have anything to do. And I was a person who was ready for this. Like, I knew what to expect. I had the expectations that I'm going to get arrested because of what I was doing. And I was ready. And I knew what I had to do in solitary confinement to keep myself going, to survive. So I stayed active, I exercised, I danced, I sang, I said prayers, and I did all I could. But still, you have 24 hours of, and you can try to sleep. It's not easy to sleep when you're not active all day, even if you do your exercises. So even if you sleep 8 hours, you still have a lot more hours to fill with having nothing to do and no one to talk to. And something that was helpful was actually talking to the prison guards and interrogators. And that's a weird thing, because when you think about interrogators, they're not your friends, they're not there to help you. And sometimes interrogations could get very very intense and very scary. I was lucky I wasn't physically tortured. I was one of the lucky ones, but then there was a lot of psychological pressure. Um, and but when you stay in solitary confinement for long enough, you want to go and talk to them. And that's actually something that they did. If you didn't answer their questions, they would just leave you in solitary confinement for days without even talking to you. I remember I tried to make conversation with prison guards, and once I actually asked one of them, "Oh, your job must be very difficult. What brought you to this field?" And then she said, "This was my dream job," and I just couldn't stop laughing, because I was wondering, why would this be your dream job? But anyways, it was very difficult, and there were some things that I had to deal with. I had physical symptoms already because of that, and also there were issues that I had to deal with after that. So for my physical symptoms, I actually had heart palpitation, and I had to visit a doctor in the prison and get medication for that, because it was bothering me a lot. After I was released from prison, I had memory issues, I had concentration issues, and I had issues with attention. My issues with attention are still present. Sometimes I struggle with attention, and I know that this is something I didn't have before this solitary confinement, something that I struggled with after this happened. Even with memory, I always had very good memory in school, but then after this experience, I struggled. I experienced claustrophobia. Even right now, it's better right now, but then for example, going to a car wash can be challenging. Like going to a car wash on my own, it can be challenging for me. Dissociations, this is something that's can actually be like a trauma symptom as well, and it's considering that isolation and solitary confinement is actually kind of torture. A lot of people who go through that experience trauma symptoms like dissociations. And that's where I want to go right now. I want to really bring this to the Canadian experience, because something that happened was that after I went through being a refugee in Turkey and I moved to Canada, I realized that solitary confinements exist in Canada, and I was shocked. And I thought, okay, this is torture. How is it that this is happening in this country that is a symbol of human rights and symbol of social justice in a way? And I was really surprised to see it happening. I want to just share some information from the literature as well, because I remember talking to one of my social worker friends, and she told me, you know what, some prisoners, they prefer to be in solitary confinement because it's safer. They don't want to be in general population area. And I think this is something we hear, but it's really important to look into the literature and see the effects of something like solitary confinement. It is actually torture. You might have someone telling you that this is better for them, this is safer, but at the end of the day, this can have serious mental health and health consequences. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the consequences. There is a substantial body of published literature there that says that solitary confinement can cause harm. They can be permanent and irreversible. There's a serious harm to mental health, anxiety, difficulty thinking, disturbances in thought content, cognitive emotional impairment, depression, suicidal ideations. And this is something that I noticed when I was in solitary confinement. The woman who was the cell next to me, I know that she tried to end her life at least twice. And that's why I say this can be very serious mental health wise. There are physical symptoms, headaches, trembling, sweaty palms, heart palpitation. Again, back to that mental health effects, the rumination, intrusive thoughts, tendency to socially withdraw. And tendency to socially withdraw is something that I've noticed in my clients as a community social worker. I have some clients who ended up in prison, especially this year, and I saw that they end up in solitary confinement somehow more often because of the whole pandemic going on. And what I noticed is that my clients were socially withdrawing. They're saying that it seems like they prefer to just like stay there in like alone, even though and you know they wanted to be out of that solitary confinement, but somehow trying to justify how they were feeling, they were withdrawing from that opportunity to socialize, even when they had the opportunity. Some other consequences are emotional flatness, losing the ability to feel, swings in emotional response, and then also there are a minority of prisoners who actually experience more extreme symptoms. There are even few cases where people had hallucinations or perceptual distortions. And I think that just like shows more like how serious it can get. When I was in solitary confinement, I was prepared and I did so many things to protect myself. Even with socializing, I knew how important it was to talk to people, even if they are my interrogators, even if they are my they are the like prison guards. They're not my friends, but I needed to socialize. We're like human beings. We need to speak with other people. So, and it was a privilege for me to know that the importance of these things. And I think a lot of people who end up in these situations, they don't know how to protect themselves. They don't know how to survive it, and it makes it harder for them to actually come out of it healthier. And something else I wanted to mention is that even though solitary confinements in Canada, they're not supposed to go longer than 15 days, but it happens all the time. What they do is that they just call it something else. So instead of saying it's solitary, it's called segregation, or it's called different names, just like a nicer name, or maybe some changes, like small changes. For example, you have a mental health professional coming to see you every morning. But then when I talk to my clients who are actually in prison right now, what they're telling me is that it's not a real meaningful interaction. And that's what you need as a human being. You need meaningful, real social environments, because this is just a human need, like eating, like sleeping. And unfortunately, what happens is that because they don't call it solitary confinement, because they don't call it even segregation, they call it something else, people end up staying there for much longer than they should. And something that happened during the pandemic was that a lot of courts were delayed. We had people who had to stay in remand for a very long period of time. And this is something that some of my clients experience. And now we have the outbreaks. And for them to manage outbreaks, it's somehow more justified to put people in solitary confinement. And I think there should be better ways to deal with this. There should be better way than torturing people to protect them, and like freeing them. And when they are still waiting for courts to decide, even like we have people who are in remands and that they're not so convicted. And I think that's just a terrible thing that's happening in our system. And yeah, so I think unfortunately, like, with COVID outbreak, we all suffered in a way. It's been difficult. But just imagine being in prison, imagine being in solitary confinement and having to deal with it. And something that happens in solitary confinement in here too is that you don't have access to same things that people in general population area have. For example, access to a TV, being able to go for a walk, being able to participate in programming. These are things that don't happen when you are in solitary confinement. You're in a small room. You can switch your lights on or off. You have no control, and there's an outbreak out there, and you don't know what's going to happen to you. And the reason I wanted to talk about this today is that we have a say in the Canadian system. We can do something, and in a lot of international cases, when it comes to doing something, we can do a lot. Yeah, we can write letters, we can write in social media, we can raise awareness. But when it comes to Canadian experience, we have more of a say. This is our country. These are our politicians, and we can, we have more privileges when it comes to access to our politicians. So I think it's really important to speak up. And I'm happy to see you're here and you're actually like taking all day to write letters. My suggestion is to write to your MLA, explain that this shouldn't be happening. People shouldn't be in solitary confinement. In Canada, they shouldn't be in solitary confinement. In Alberta, they shouldn't be in Edmonton. This is happening in our city. Yeah, I think that's something that I really wanted to share today. Also, something else actually, maybe some people say that, okay, so the international cases, there are human rights activists, they're like political activists. It's different, the people in our prison system, they're criminals. But I think we need to remember that, first of all, we don't know everyone's story. We don't know what brought them to that place. Also, we know that there is a racist system that is putting more people of color than it's supposed to, more racialized individuals as supposed to. And unfortunately, with solitary confinements, there is data that show that people with serious mental illness are more likely to end up in solitary confinements, which is terrible because it's already terrible for your mental health. So you shouldn't be putting people with mental illness in solitary confinement, if anything. So yeah, I think this is happening in our own community, and we have the power to do something, and we are more likely to be heard. So yeah, I invite you all to please contact your politicians and ask them to change things, and just to remember that no one deserves to be tortured. No matter what they did, no one deserves to be tortured, and we should be better than that, than being okay with this happening in our community.
Thank you so much, Dorsa. That's really a lot of food for thought. I mean, and thank you for using the emotional spoons to share with us your personal experience too, because I understand that's not always easy, and I appreciate you being able to tie that into what's happening here in Canada as well. I liked what you brought up about people's attitudes about prisoners, because I think that's very common. They are, just as you said, they're willing to say, oh, but that's in countries where people are being imprisoned just for going to a protest or whatever. We're happy to work on their behalf, but these are criminals. These are bad people, and why would I want to support them? So I'd like to hear more a little bit about that. Like, how do you talk to people about that issue, just in terms of, they still have basic human rights, and they're still human, and people of color are disproportionately affected by this? Or what else do you discuss?
Something that made it in a way easier for the Iranian experience was that we ended up having a lot of human rights advocates going into prisons, and they spoke up, and they were just sharing these stories about what's happening in our prison system to everyone, not only to human rights advocates, not only to politicians, but to everyone. And they brought up those stories. Unfortunately, when it comes to people in prison here, no one shares their stories, and it's just it's heartbreaking. And as a social worker saying this happening, and I feel like there's not much, it's hard to do anything. And I think you're right. It's important to remind people that, these are real people. They have families. Sometimes some of them, maybe they made a mistake, and and some people end up there because of mental illness. That's terrible. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people with serious mental illness in prisons. It's not where they should be. They should be in hospitals if they need if they need help. I work with clients who have serious mental illness, mental health issues, and it just breaks my heart that they end up in prison. And it's not much that we can do. And unfortunately, when you even compare that data that's out there, you see that people for the same crime, people who are racialized end up getting like harsher sentences. And I think this is also like a good reminder that it's first of all, no matter what you did, you don't deserve to be tortured. You have to be treated humanely. And second of all, there are injustices in our system too, and there are people who end up in prisons that shouldn't be in prison. And that's why and it can be anyone. It can be a mistake that any of us do, and somehow we end up in prison system. We don't know, right? It's I think it's helpful to look at it that way. And also, like, just looking at people's backgrounds and experiences, especially looking at like serious crime, its connection to childhood experience of trauma. So what's bringing these people here? Like, how can we rehabilitate people? How can we help them come back to our society and being more or successful members of our society? And we don't want to re-traumatize people, even if you look at it in a way of like, what's better for me and my community. I don't want to bring people to prison, re-traumatize them, make things worse, and then have them back in our society. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that you said that really struck home for me was, the excuse given that, some people want to be in confinement because it's safer or something to that effect. But I feel like that's such a sort of a red herring. Like, if people are not safe in the general population, that's a failing of the prison. That's the reason, or the solution to that is not let's throw them in solitary to protect them. The solution has to be more and better staff, right?
Definitely. And there are people, people who are in prison, especially in remand centers. You see people staying there for longer than they should be. Honestly, even when you look at the court system and how slow it moves, there are people there that can be waiting for their courts happening. Like, they can be waiting in the community. They're not really unsafe to be out of prison, but unfortunately they keep staying there, especially people who don't have any advocate. They don't have support, people who are marginalized, and people who are not able to hire a good lawyer.
I don't know if you're seeing all the comments in the chat. Shelby has provided some good information about Canadian cases.
Yeah, I was just going to mention a case I was aware of. I'm trying to remember which province it was in. I think it was in Newfoundland, like fairly recently. And the equivalent of like their ombudsman, which I think is called the people's representative there, had looked into this. There was this one case where this young man who was Indigenous was being held basically in solitary confinement, like no natural light, like these really restrictive measures. And word had gotten out through other inmates. And when the ombudsman there had looked into it, because there's a lot of rules on how long someone can be in like administrative segregation before they're being reviewed. Like there's a lot of rules around that. And what the ombudsman there had found was that the building that this person was being held in, they weren't calling it solitary confinement or administrative segregation. And so this person just wasn't ever being reviewed, but the conditions that they were being held in were actually like inhumane. And this person could barely speak, like just because of the psychological like trauma that they had been through. They had been in there for, I think it was almost 2 years solid. I think there was like some breaks where they'd be put back into kind of public units and then they go back, but it was like years that this person spent in there. And just because of the way that it was like classified or the name of the building that they were in, they just like slipped through the cracks, and it took this getting leaked out for anything to be done, but it was completely inhumane. So the reason I raise that is just because, you know, we think, a lot of people think like, oh, it's Canada, I'm sure we're doing like a great job, but it's tough. Like the voices of people, inmates, they're really oppressed and they get a really bad rap. Like people think like, oh, they've done something, but just as Dorsa said, like people in remand centers, especially, like they have not been sentenced. Like we don't even know if they did anything. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, the reason that we had this restriction, the 15 days restriction to solitary confinement, is because someone died, because someone ended up taking their life. I can't remember her name. It's just can't remember, unfortunately, but it was actually a death that caused it. And why do we have to get to the point where people are losing their lives and then do something, and then even not do anything, basically just because, as you said, they call it something else. They don't call it segregation, and then it just goes on for a very long period of time, for even a year or two, which is, I can't even imagine how terrible it would be. I was only in solitary confinement for 27 days, and I'm saying that it was torture. So I can't imagine someone who's been in solitary confinement for 2 years. I can't imagine what they went through.
I came late to your presentation, Dorsa. Sorry for that. But I understand you went through the solitary confinement in Turkey. Is that
in Iran? In Iran.
In Iran. Sorry, yeah, Iran. I wanted to ask you whether you see the Canadian system, you know, just more in the system on the more inclined to to born from punishment rather than from what the Aboriginal people are used to in our First Nation here, the restorative justice that doesn't look for ways to make inmates suffer, but more of the reconciliation aspect of or you know a reflective way of for people, or ways that are more humane in the end.
Yeah, I think restorative justice is actually a much better way of dealing with crime. I used to volunteer at an organization that was supporting youth who were involved with the criminal justice system. Interestingly, none of the people that I saw there were people of color or like racialized individuals. So unfortunately, it seems like even though this system, that restorative justice exists, it's still, I mean, in my experience of what I've seen, I don't think it's still inclusive enough. It's still not really supporting the people that needs the support most. But yeah, there needs to be more of that happening in Canada. Because, you know, it's like, as I mentioned before, what's the point of re-traumatizing someone? And when you look at people's history, people who are ending up in prison, you see a lot of trauma there. What are we doing to rehabilitate them, or are we making things worse? Or we are spending all this money, even if you look at it with a like financial economic perspective, we're spending all this money and we're making things worse. So yeah, I think this system has to change. It shouldn't be this way.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask what is the best approach to what program is the best rehabilitation program in Canada that you could build on, or that we as Canadians can build on, in your view? Or do we need a radically different approach to rehabilitation?
I do think we need a radically different approach, but restorative justice is something that I do believe in. I think it is much more effective than a punishment, like going through punishment, putting people there, or even separating people from the society. How long can you separate someone from the society because they're like you consider them as dysfunctional? There should be a way to for people to learn from things that went wrong, right? I mean, restorative justice, the good thing about it is that people have the opportunity to understand and the effect of their behavior. They get to, in some cases, they get to talk to the victims. They get to see the people, like the effects of what they've done. And I think that's what makes a difference, that human connection, seeing the consequences. It's not something that they only heard, it's something that they can see it. And really taking action to apologize, to change things for the better. I think this is something that this is a way that we're going to go in the future. But definitely torturing people is something that we need to stop doing.
Thanks again.
I would say that in the Amnesty language, we use torture and we use ill treatment to differentiate what is purposely doing pain or producing pain instead of neglecting the prisoner in a way that they will suffer eventually mentally or the otherwise. But certainly because torture, yes, is a grave action, or the consequences are similar but not the same. I was in solitary confinement in Argentina, and under the military, and it was a secret detention camp, so that they could do anything they wanted without accountability, and torture was a way of conducting business. But then at one point we were transferred to an official prison, sort of accountable prison, because of foreign visitors. I was the Red Cross Amnesty visiting the country. And by then, we were accountable. I mean, we were counted as prisoners. So we were safe in some way because we will not disappear. But the ill treatment in the prison was evident because we were subversive prisoners. I consider that ill treatment. In the concentration camp, there was torture. And in the prison, there was ill treatment because we were neglected. We were punished in the way of not giving us food or anything according to different situation in the prison. But certainly there were no the events that were in the concentration camp. And so in some way, in Canada, I don't know the definition how we can assess how prisoners are treated here in Canada, because there is a convention against torture in the, and then whether Canada is violating the convention or not, according to the terms of it. And I think Michael is there, or Robert, you are there as well, if you have an opinion on the how, according to statistics, I've seen that in the chat they put some statistic on prisoners in Canada, how the convention, the committee on the convention would assess the treatment of prisoners in Canada, if it is in some way considered torture or ill treatment or whatever. I don't know if you have an opinion. The same for you, Dorsa. I didn't want to rule out your but you know, so how the question is how Canada is viewed in the international instruments in the treatment of prisoners, how category we are.
Well, I've just mentioned from my awareness of the Canadian legal system, first of all, the Charter of Rights protects against cruel and unusual punishment under the Charter directly. So torture would fall within that. So one would be able to, as one's lawyer would certainly raise that. International law can be applied in a more general way. It can be the international instruments you're referring to can be made reference to, and they would underpin, in this case, the charter right, and that would succeed. I guess many times the issue is, was the person tortured? A person may make a claim, and of course, the guards, the prison staff are going to deny that that's what took place. And it's very difficult sometimes to get to the bottom of the issue. But certainly, if there's credible evidence of torture, that would lead to a Charter of Rights challenge to the actions and a request for some relief.
And I think, sorry, and thank you for what you shared and what you mentioned about the difference of torture and mistreatment. I think if we look at the literature that's out there, they're showing the consequences of isolation, consequences of long-term segregation. I think it makes sense to define this as torture, and this is like based on what the thing that I looked at, this is how I see it. And I think you mentioned neglect. I think neglect, it can be, you know, first of all, I actually don't see it as neglect, because I think neglect in a way happens when you're not aware. I think there's been court cases, the government is aware, the officials are aware, and there is that general awareness of the consequences of segregation on individuals. And I think when you are aware and you're not actively doing anything, that's I think actively not doing anything when you know what's happening, I think it's still considered as actively torturing someone. Not doing anything doesn't really always mean not contributing to torture, not contributing to oppressive behavior, or that's how I view it. I understand that people can have different opinion on this, but this is how I see it. And you know, torture can have many forms. There are definitely tortures that are more extreme. There are maybe different levels, but psychological harm can be as terrible as physical harm, and it can be as long lasting. It can affect people for a long time. Or that's how I view solitary confinement.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Dorsa.
And you know, sorry, I wanted to, sorry for that. Also, I wanted to mention that, you know, something that happens with the prisoners here is that they don't have a say. They don't have, it's easier to oppress, or it's easier to keep oppression going when people don't have a voice. Unfortunately, a lot of people in our prison system don't have a voice. And that in a way that makes it worse, because you know that the court cases are there. You know that this conversation has been going on for a long time. You know that the government has agreed to stop solitary confinement for more than 15 days. Then why is it still happening? And I think that's something that, for me, it's like very disturbing.
Dorsa, thank you so much for sharing all of this. This is really, it's really thought-provoking. You know, even within Amnesty, you know, we've always used the terms torture and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. And so, I mean, not to parse about whether something is torture or not, really, we can agree at least that the solitary confinement is certainly not acceptable, right? we've gone way over time, but it's okay because that's okay. Like I said, everybody's gone over time today, but everybody is engaged and wants to talk to you, so that's okay. So does anyone have any more questions before we release Dorsa so she doesn't have to stay here all day?
Since we're here in an Amnesty meeting, I just wanted to mention that Julian Assange, for instance, if he's extradited to the US by the UK judge, by the British judge, that is a journalist who will probably spend the rest of his life in jail because he won't get anything remotely approaching a fair trial. He'll be placed in solitary confinement, probably for decades. And that's the stakes. And that is going to, the whole point of that is to create a chilling effect on journalism around the world.
That is very chilling. I mean, truly.
Yeah, that's the purpose. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's
Yeah.
ultimate punishment for society.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
No, I'll tell you why.
Well, thank you again, Dorsa, for sharing with us and sharing your knowledge. That was really powerful to hear.
Thank you.
And really a lot of food for thought for me. So, especially because I come from a family who has a bunch of cops and prison guards, and so we don't always get along.
I want you.
And thank you, Shelby, for putting all the resources.
Yes, that was great. Thank you so much for all those links. It's
Thank
really
you.
helpful.
Don't ask me anything.
And Dorsa, if you want to say a parting word, you absolutely are welcome to. And if you want to stick around while we continue our evening, that's great as well.
I do need to go right now, but I really appreciate that
Can
you.
I have some
I'm
water?
really happy and enjoyed the chat with everyone. And yeah, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.